So thank you for being here and welcome. And very excited to talk about complexity today. As I'm looking at the faces of a lot of people who's been through some of our training in our OD and Change certificate, like Didi and Carol and quite a few faces here. You would know that we do almost nothing if it doesn't include at least the Cynefin framework and some complexity thinking. So at Wolfsview Academy, it's something that we love, and it's something that I think if you start understanding it and applying it to your thinking and the way you work in OD, that you can't really unsee it or undo it. And I think in the current time that we're in, it's even more important to not, as a thinking tool, as a sense-making tool, to help you make decisions, to help you move forward through this time. So I'm very, very excited to have Ingrid and Sonja here today. And I believe that Christy would also be chipping in every now and again. Yeah, I think I'm just going to hand over to Ingrid. It's 9:05, so I think it's okay if we start.
Lekker. Thank you so much. I'm like jumping out of my skin with excitement at the privilege of being able to have some time with Sonja, who's such an illustrious thinker. I know she's very modest and will hate the things I'm going to say, but it's a genuine privilege to be with someone who's a teacher and such an experienced consultant, person with such profile in South Africa and beyond, and her company is called More Beyond. And just it's a real privilege, and I'm so grateful that you agreed to spend this time with us when I know that you have a mountain of work on top of you. If there's something you want to add, tell us about Cognitive Edge, tell us about More Beyond and how you connect, and then we can maybe get started with the conversation, where I'm going to be asking some questions, and then between me and Christa, unpacking some of what Sonja says, maybe asking for some examples and trying to land some of this amazing thinking in a way that we can start seeing how we might be able to apply it to the problems we grapple with and our clients grapple with. So Sonja, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work.
Thanks, Ingrid, and it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. As you said, this is an amazing community. So Cognitive Edge, maybe to start there, Cognitive Edge is the company that Professor Dave Snowden founded. He is the, shall we call him the father of Cynefin? So it's a framework that he created. We realized yesterday, 21 years ago. So Cynefin comes of age this year. We can have a party for it. So I've been working with Dave since 2002. We both started we met in IBM. And I've been kind of his exclusive South African partner since around 93. No, sorry, not 93, sorry, 2013. And so More Beyond is a small consultancy that I founded. And I've been, working here in South Africa and internationally, speaking, doing consultancy, etc., practically applying some of the thinking around, not only Dave's thinking around complexity, but other thought leaders as well. So yeah, it's been an exciting journey. I'm super busy. I'm not sure if I knew that COVID-19 was going to happen, I would have chosen that moment to become CEO of a global company. But, there we go. So I think that's enough about me.
Yeah, thank you. And you're managing a team across however many time zones. So Yeah, it sounds like an amazing challenge to be plunged into the middle of that kind of role. This context.
It is. I think it is a very practical, not an introduction, but dump into complexity, unceremoniously, because we have people from New Zealand to Canada, so it literally is, you know, across the whole spectrum.
Amazing. And so you have to get over the Enneagram 5 overwhelm, hey? And wing it and sink or swim.
Yeah, luckily, I think winging it has kind of been my approach to life since a very young age. So I prefer to call it winging it, not fake it till you make it, like other consultants do. But you can interpret it whichever way you want to.
But we also know as consultants, you only have to be about 15 minutes ahead of the client to add at least some value, right?
I think it's all about confidence. I think that's the...
Let's not go there. But yeah, so I mean, my thoughts about today is that for me, complexity thinking, the theory, the thinking, the frameworks are almost like a thoughtware upgrade. That many of us were schooled in quite old school paradigms and thinking, you know, like thinking about root cause analysis and quite linear ways of thinking and quite siloed ways of thinking. And I feel as though I've been running on outdated thoughtware for a long time. So I'm hoping to get a thoughtware upgrade in this conversation with you, to download some of your thinking and start running my thinking differently. And the purpose of kind of new thoughtware is to be able to get a more optimal grip on reality and to be able to be more effective at solving really, really difficult problems where our old thinking just doesn't really cut it. So that was kind of my framing in my mind for how to make the most of this time with you. And yeah, so I think I'd like to start with the question of how are you making sense of the reality that we're in at the moment? How are you kind of trying to come to terms with the reality of where we are? And, you know, maybe that'll give us some concepts to grapple with some of the incredible glossary of complexity thinking that we've come across, like entanglement and, you know, these very interesting words that are quite unfamiliar to many of us. And maybe through unpacking some of that terminology, we'll start getting into some of the substance. So if I can just hand over to you, what the hell is going on?
You would start with the most difficult question, won't you, Ingrid?
Of course.
You're assuming that I have any way of making sense of what's going on. Now, I think, you know, it's interesting. So I've been hosting webinars over the last few weeks with some of the, you know, the global thinkers in the space of complexity. And one of the things that we've all kind of been reflecting on is in the past, we felt a bit, you know, one of them said she felt like Chicken Little, you know, you're the, you know, or the boy crying wolf, you know, telling everybody that the world is complex and everything is uncertain and, you know, you need to adapt. And in the past, you know, people had, I think, a conceptual understanding that there is uncertainty, etc., but there was still enough certainty for them to kind of entertain the thought as something really interesting and then just move on and do what they've always done. And I think what's happened now with this pandemic is that we have all been very rudely introduced to the reality of concepts like entanglement. We've seen now that the world is complex and that there is very little stability and certainty. And so it's really interesting to see some of you know, what is being said. You know, so many people refer to COVID-19 as a black swan, for those of you who are familiar with Nassim Taleb's work. But in reality, it's not, because many people saw this coming. Many epidemiologists have been warning us for a long time that, you know, there will be a pandemic. But I think we chose to ignore that. And you know, this starts coming into some of the mindsets that you talk about, because I think we have so many biases at play, and we choose to believe that we live in a world that is predictable and stable and certain, and that these kinds of things won't happen to us. And I think that has been severely challenged. And I think something else, you know, and this is, I'm not being particularly coherent, because I'm also struggling to make sense of everything that's going on. I think what boggles the mind is just how many people seem to still be in denial about, you know, this is just a flu. Please let us out. You know, we want to go and hug people. And I feel the same way. But I think we're underestimating this. You know, that's the one side of it. And then also just all of the black and white, either or thinking, you know, it's interesting just to see the splitting. And we had a conversation in another forum the other day about double binds. But I think one of the things that's happening is, in the past, you know, we had dilemmas that we faced in business, you know, and I think many of you coming from the OD fraternity, you would have been part of processes where we taught leaders how to deal with polarities and, you know, all of these things. And I think what we're sitting with now are truly unresolvable polarities. You know, it's how do you choose between, you know, for a doctor, for example, how do you choose who to save and who to let die? How do we choose between saving people's lives and the economy? And so I fully agree with you. I think we need a new operating paradigm, and we need to get out of this either or thinking and start looking for ands. So I'm not sure if any of that made sense, but I struggle to make sense of what's going on most times. You know, it's so ironic. I've been working in the field of uncertainty for a long time, but something that I've realized is that we are able to deal with uncertainty if we can see the end. So, you know, it's going to be uncertain for a while, and then it's going to go back to stability and certainty. You know, people are calling that normal. And I think what we're starting to see is that there is no, we can't see the end of this. You know, we're kind of in perpetual uncertainty, and that is hugely tiring.
Thank you so much. That's a really helpful introduction. And I think it sets up a really nice entry point for some further questions. But what I'm really, a moment of realization while you were talking is that the thinking that you're bringing is not pretending to have an answer. So it's almost the wrong question to say what's going on and expect some kind of answer. And what complexity thinking seems to do, if I'm drawing on what you've just said, is appreciate uncertainty, appreciate fragility and not knowing. And the fact that framing things as this is a dilemma, this is the polarity, this is the paradox, as we often do in our work, as you said, is missing something. So even that thinking was really missing something. And I'm interested in what you said about that Chicken Little crying, you know, people thought you were crying wolf. I remember in the one conversation I was on, Nora Bateson was saying, we've been speaking about this for a very long time. We've been talking about fragility. We've been, you know, and the black swan versus the white swan example, for those of you who don't know, a black swan is a completely unpredictable left field event. A white swan is something very destabilizing that was predictable. So people have been talking about the need for a new type of thinking for a long time, and this situation has plunged us into it, where we can't see the end. And as you say, we're in continuous uncertainty. It's exhausting. And leaders, and all of us too, at different scales, are being confronted with unresolvable polarities. things where we're having to make impossible choices. I'm seeing leaders and, you know, people being quite paralyzed and just getting stuck into micro detail that they think is manageable. So yeah, I think I'd like to step back to absolute ground zero in a sense and ask you about what is uncertainty? What is complexity? It might seem like such an obvious question. What is uncertainty? But maybe you've got a way of thinking about it that's really not my assumption and not our assumption. So how did these thought leaders start thinking about uncertainty in the first place? My kind of exposure is that it came from evolutionary biology. But maybe you can kind of fill us in on some of the groundwork around thinking about uncertainty.
Maybe before I go there, just linking to something that you just said, Ingrid, is I think one of the reasons why we have been able to deny, or why not able to, but why we've been tempted to deny that we live in an uncertain and complex world for such a long time is our, I almost want to say, addiction to control, and also our over-focus on efficiency. So when you bring up the notion of fragility, one of the reasons why our organizations and our societies, etc., have become so fragile is because we've over-optimized them for a particular context. You know, so if you look at you know, everybody has kind of centralized and over-optimized their supply chains, so that now, you know, we've got single suppliers who may not even be in South Africa. And now all of a sudden with lockdown, which, you know, we never really expected, we suddenly find out just how fragile those things are. So we've, in our search for efficiency, we've basically lost all of our resilience. But I think we can come back to that. In terms of, you know, where, so I'm not entirely sure exactly why people started looking at uncertainty, but, you know, one of my favorite quotes is by Diego Espinosa, and he says, "We have outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants." And it's really interesting because...
Say that again. That's such an amazing quote. We've outsourced our relationship with uncertainty to certainty merchants.
So, I mean, just so think about, for example, entire industries like the insurance industry. What do they actually sell? They sell certainty. Yeah. I think very often leaders, and, you know, in this community, I think, I don't know how many of you guys are change practitioners, but I think very often leaders and change practitioners get seduced by people to become certainty merchants for them. And so we almost, you know, and that's why I really like that quote, because we instead of us cultivating a relationship with the inherent uncertainty of life, because I think if we are all honest, you know, we all know life is not certain. I can go to the doctor and get a very unexpected diagnosis and all my certainty is gone. I can walk out the gate and be run down by a car. You know, it's like, or I can walk out the gate and meet my soulmate. You know, life is not certain, but in business contexts, we've kind of seduced ourselves that we can create certainty. And so I think, especially people who've been working in the natural sciences, they've been dealing with uncertainty forever. You know, I studied meteorology, and, you know, that's, I think, more closely related to chaos than complexity in many ways. But, you know, we've always kind of known that the weather is not completely predictable. You know, we've gotten better at it, but now with global warming, all of our models are out the door again. So I think in the, you know, natural scientists have always kind of been interested in things like uncertainty, complexity, resilience. And so we had systems thinking. You know, that many people feel that complexity is just an evolution of systems thinking, but it's actually quite different. But many of the so complex adaptive systems, if you start doing some research and going back to the kind of roots of it, many of the people who wrote about it either came from ecosystem sciences or from, many of them are philosophers. Dave Snowden, for example, is a physicist and a philosopher. So complexity science is very much an interdisciplinary, a transdisciplinary science, and it's also very much still in its infancy, it's emerging. So you'll find very different definitions of complexity coming from the different streams.
That's amazing. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. And there's quite a lot where I felt like, slow down. I want to stop you there and ask about this and that. So the first thing I want to go back to is you spoke about an addiction to control and efficiency, and that our organizations and our ways of doing things have been over-optimized for a particular context. And that for me brings up an image of rigidity, that if we've done that things aren't adaptable. And I remember being at a Dave Snowden talk once where he was speaking about evolution, and he said that that's setting you up for extinction if you become rigid and not adaptable to sudden changes in context. So I wonder if you could just speak about the distinction you made between this control and resilience, rigidity and resilience. What is resilience from a complexity thinking perspective? What does it mean? Immediately my mind goes to kind of agility, but we've been trying to become more agile. What's been missing in our thinking about adaptability and resilience?
So in complexity, and in particular, when we start talking about resilience, there's a whole bunch of what we call requisites. So for example, or to answer your question, we've got this idea that resilience is the ability to bounce back. So a system is disturbed or a person goes through trauma, and being able to bounce back almost to your old self is how we think about resilience. But resilience, in a way, is also transformability. It is the ability to, Dave Snowden talks about being able for there to be a coherence of identity, even while going through transformation or change. Alicia Juarero, who she's a philosopher who, a lot of our thinking around constraints, for example, comes from her. She talks about in ecosystems, an organism has what she calls an adaptive space. So it's a trying to find words to explain this, but it's almost like an option field that an organism or an ecosystem, where they are able to explore and exploit that field. And when you get to the edges of that field and you no longer have the resources to exploit, that is when you start running out of resilience. And that is when you need to be able to adapt into a new space. And I think a lot of that applies to businesses as well. And where the problem comes in with this over-optimization is we've stripped out all of the, let's call it redundancy or slack, out of our systems in this search for efficiency. So many organizations that I encounter, I don't know about banks nowadays, but I try to avoid branches at all costs. But I can still remember several years ago, there were these people called floats in a bank, in a branch. So they were people who could play several different roles. Say if one person got sick, then this person could step in, or somebody could go on leave. We went through a phase where all of those people were let go because they were seen as superfluous. So now in a branch, if you can imagine, like not even COVID-19, but if we had, just a bad flu epidemic and 5 people fell in a bank branch, then what happens? We keep talking about, we want learning organizations. You talk about agile. A key aspect of agility is also learning agility. And we say we want learning organizations, but there are some people who are essentially stopwatched. we have so over optimized these systems. We've checked how long it takes people to do a certain task, and then we give them a particular target, and there's just no slack. So I always get quite amused when they say, you know, but we've given our people access to Udemy and they can study and they, you know, they can. When must they do that? There is literally no time for people to learn. And so the problem is, if we are so over optimized, you know, so we've got single suppliers for our key, you know, in our supply chain for key resources. We've got staff doing more than one person's job. We've got very little diversity. You know, and something else that is a requisite for resilience, you know, I like to use metaphors. So if we contrast, for example, a sheep farm with the Kruger National Park or any kind of a natural ecosystem, if there's a natural disaster like a drought, I can be fairly certain that Kruger will survive. It might look different, but because there's a diversity of, you know, there's biodiversity, some of the animals and Kruger will survive. The sheep farm will all kind of die together because they're all the same. And I think we've made diversity a problem to solve, not a strategic asset to nurture. And we're focusing we're focusing on external or very shallow diversity, male, female, race, you know, all of these things. Yes. We should be thinking about cognitive diversity. You know, do we have people that think differently? And I don't know, some of you might be HR practitioners, but it's, you know, I always ask people, you know, so when the executives tell you to hire people that think differently, how long do they last in your organization?
Sure.
So yeah,
Sonja, can I stop you, because this is just so great, and I want to like sift out some of the ideas and give us a bit of time to absorb them, so that we kind of can have one light bulb moment at a time and not the supernova one after the other. That's what's happening to me.
Stop me when I go. I can ramble, so stop me if I do.
It's not rambling, it's like a galactic explosion. It's wonderful. So I just want to taste something. Like what I'm hearing here is, at the core of resilience is this thing that you're saying is an option field. And it's not about this idea that we've had about bouncing back to our old selves, either individually or at the level of teams or organizations. And that would actually be a mistake to think in that way now, having been hit by this contextual white swan, which feels like a black swan.
They call it a black elephant, actually. I think it's the elephant in the room we chose not to see, kind of a...
Oh, we've been trampled by the black elephant. So what I'm hearing there is, don't think like that. Don't think that things are going to go back to normal and that I'm going to bounce back and my normal routines are going to resume, etc. But we need to think about this adaptive space and the option fields that we have to explore and exploit a completely new reality. And that is a big thinking shift for us individually, as well as maybe business owners and change agents in organizations. So I think what I'm hearing there is we've really been thinking about agility in quite a limited way. And we haven't been thinking about learning in the right way. We haven't been, we've been talking about learning organizations, but we haven't been developing cognitive agility, true cognitive agility, which for me would be the ability to think about option fields and not try and find things to control. And the key thing that I'm hearing as well is this idea of having stripped out redundancy. And we shouldn't think about things in the option field as redundant. Is that right? Like this kind of floating person in the bank creates options in a way, or allows us to be more maneuverable in a crisis. But having stripped out all of this, it's almost like we've backed ourselves into a corner and become too rigid with the stopwatch, with trying to manage performance in very rigid ways, that we've lost our responsivity to context. Is that a good kind of restating of what you've said? To just what I'm trying to do is just slow it down so that we can make sure we're understanding the quality of what you're giving us.
Yeah, I think it is, Ingrid. I think we have come to believe that the context is stable in a way, you know, and most of you would have heard of this acronym called VUCA by now.
Yeah.
VUCA became very fashionable, and many consultancies started using it for branding, but didn't really offer any different offerings around it. But if you truly, and I think this is in a way, the gift of COVID-19, because it showed us that VUCA is real. And I think so what you said is true. We've basically stripped ourselves of options. So in all of the drives for efficiency, cost cutting, you know, this extreme focus on shareholder value, all of that has brought us to a place where our organizations are fragile and unable to adapt. And I think one of the other things is also that we've had a very internal focus for a long time, and we have not really been paying attention to what is happening to context. And by the time that we realize that our context has shifted, you know, so for example, people in the banking industry, the disruption that's been happening there has been happening for quite a long time. But in the beginning, we were a bit in denial around it. And when it really started hitting us, you know, then, you know, we or many of the banks that I work with in particular, they keep trying to innovate within the same existing option field. And then they also start focusing on efficiency even more. So now we need to cut more costs, and we need to, so if you're in a cost cutting efficiency drive, how will you explore a new option field? Where is the time and the money and the will going to come from? You know, so it's almost by the time our traditional organizations realize the need not only to be agile, because agile, I think, has become almost synonymous with going faster. And I think many of us are going faster in the wrong direction. So taking a step back and thinking about what do we need to adapt into. Not many organizations are having that conversation.
Amazing. So it's a combination of internal focus, a focus on the shareholder value, the cost cutting, the profit margins, that has created a massive blind spot in terms of reality. So even though people have been saying VUCA, you know, they didn't really appreciate the U in VUCA, the uncertainty, and that it's actually real and it demands a different way of thinking. It's not about faster and cheaper, which for me almost, I love the metaphor of a kind of monoculture or a lack of biodiversity, because it's almost like the thinking has been the monoculture of we're just going to farm sheep. And that's a metaphor that Mats Alverson uses in organizational theory, is like, are we cultivating stupidity and farming sheep only, rather than creating a kind of permaculture thinking environment with diversity and connections and adaptability? So I think I like the metaphors that you're putting on the table, because I think we can kind of move into them and explore them. And they're very, very different to things like, this organization needs to be a well-oiled machine, and we're going to pull this lever, and we're going to, you know, it's a totally different mindset and way of framing the world. And what I'm also hearing is there's no boundary between the organization and the context. Like if you have an internal focus, you're missing the boundary between the organization and reality, and you're failing to understand the nature of that relationship. Is that kind of on track with what you're saying?
Yes, I think so that mechanistic metaphor that you're talking about is one of our biggest problems. Because if you think of a machine, Ingrid, a machine or even a really complicated one, like a jumbo jet, is a closed system. I can tell you exactly where does the plane stop. What is this system? And while it is impacted by its environment, it's not co-evolving with its environment. So the environment's not changing the plane, and the plane is not really changing the environment. Complex systems are open systems. So maybe what I find useful is to go back to the root words of these two notions. So complicated, plik. The root word plik means folded. So even if you imagine a really complicated fold, like an origami little animal, it is a discrete system. I can unfold it. It might take me some time and some expertise, and I may need to be really careful, but I can unfold it and I can fully understand how it works, and I can refold it, and afterwards I can replicate it exactly the same way. Complex systems, the word plex, means woven, or I prefer, the idea of entangled. Now, some of these systems, you would know if you've got several balls of wool all tangled together, you can still untangle them, but it gets harder. If you have if you think of in South Africa, we've got these bushes called hakensteek dorings, those ones. If you try and untangle a tangled bush, you almost can't do it without breaking it. And so this notion of, and it's also very difficult to see where does one system stop and where does it end. So if you think of an ecosystem, where does it stop? Because it's exchanging energy with the air. You've got weather systems that come into play. It is interacting with the human systems around it. It's an open system. So if we have an idea that that our organizations are like well-oiled machines, implicit in that is that we can, to an extent, ignore context.
Yeah.
Because we are separate from our competitors. We are in a way separate from our customers. We interact with them, but they're out there.
Yes.
And that is a very dangerous assumption, because our order is only, these systems are too open. We are always at the mercy of external influences.
So there, what you're drawing there is the distinction you pointed to earlier between systems thinking, traditional systems thinking, which might be a kind of closed system, cybernetics, that kind of stuff, which comes from a kind of engineering mindset, to complex adaptive systems thinking, which is about open systems that are entangled, that are interacting with their environment in I don't even want to use the word mutual, because that implies kind of two, as opposed to maybe 20 entangled balls of wool. And that wovenness is something we fail to appreciate. We've thought about our organizations in a way that is machine-like and rigid, and that thinking allows us to ignore the entanglement, which is why we find our things breaking. So I want to just stop there for a sec, because I think a lot has been put out there. I want to invite Christo, just what's really sinking in for you, and what are the light bulb moments occurring for you in what Sonja's offering us so far in the conversation?
So much, Ingrid, Sonja, so much. It's just so much. It's like overwhelming. But I was thinking, and I've been intrigued since you mentioned it in a brief conversation yesterday, Sonja, the double-minded leaders phase and what not just leaders, all people in organizations and in households, etc., face certain kinds of double binds. Leaders more so because of the impact and extent of the decisions that they have to make. And then you spoke about resilience and resilience as where we have not fallen into this trap of designing out all the redundancy and removing all the slack from the system. And what just struck me in my own thinking, and for me that hooks to the double bind that we find ourselves in thinking, is I think in our self-development technologies, leadership development technologies, and even in our work design and the way that we design our life, we do exactly the same. We self-optimize. We're on this whole drive of just the right thoughts and just the right inputs and just the right program every day. And what we have designed out is we have designed out daydreaming. We have designed out the poetic mode. We have designed out messing around, doing nothing. We have designed out all of those things that allows us to have a diverse world, not just an inner world, but a diverse world, a world that's diverse through our perception and our ways of making sense and making meaning in the world. I think to some extent, because we have been caught up in this, self-agility. You have to be faster, you have to do things faster, you have to be more effective, you need to reach your billion sooner. And as a leader as well, you have to be this good leader and you have to be so effective and you have to, all of that stuff that just reduced in an ongoing way the diversity. Is almost like we have become these technological extensions. We have become extensions of this machine that we imagine our organizations and our world to be. It's like a flip, which that's one of the things that struck me. Is I think maybe there's something in the way that we approach or just come to terms, come to grips with ourselves that can maybe make the adaptive space a little bit more open, because it's become very cluttered by this self-optimization of ourselves. That's the one thing. The other thing that's just a question that arises for me, when systems are so open, and they interact with other systems and the boundaries between the systems are not always clear, that probably raises questions around identity. And I think in crisis, we want to fall back on identity. In fact, not even in crisis. In our normal life, we just want to have some sort of stable identity that can sort of chuck us through this thing towards our desired future. But when first of all, you realize that the systems in which you find yourself, and perhaps even the system that you yourself at some level are, is not so clearly boundaried, that creates a whole lot of identity issues. And you spoke about one of the requisites for resilience as coherence of identity, and that's just something that interests me. I would love to know how you think about coherence of identity in a space where that identity is not as obvious as we maybe wished it would be.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting thing to think about, Christo. I think so this idea of coherence is a really interesting one. So you spoke about, we want to think about our identities as stable. But Jennifer Garvey-Berger, in her book, The 5 Leadership Mind Traps, which is around the mind traps that keep us from dealing with complexity. She talks about the mind trap of ego and how we can see that we've changed and grown and that our identity has morphed in the past. But we tend to think that we're not going to change much into the future. We've kind of always in this thing of I've now arrived in my identity, which is a really funny way to think. And so I think it's understanding that identities are not stable, and coherence is a very difficult thing for me. It's such an important concept, but it's difficult to explain. It's almost easier to explain, or we all know what incoherent is. So when we're in the company of people who have had too much gin to drink, their speech becomes incoherent. We can no longer make sense of the sentences. But coherence is a difficult thing to explain. But I think from an identity perspective, how I've made sense of it is coherence of identity for me has got something to do with remaining recognizable. So you've changed. You are not the same Christo as 5 years ago. And 5 years from now, you will not be the same Christo as you were today. But I can still recognize you as Christo. And I think that is something that we need to think about, because we've gotten so, as we are addicted to control, we are also addicted to, in a way, homogeneity or stability. So I very often get myself in trouble speaking to communities like this and to management and leadership communities, because one of the words that I think should be, in a way, banned from our systems, and that is I'm being much more extreme than normal, because when we get into Cynefin, we'll see the other side. But this notion of alignment, we need to be aligned. I don't know how many of you, how often do you use that word in your organizations? We need to be aligned to purpose, aligned to values, aligned to goals. Now, alignment has become a euphemism for agreement. So we all need to agree that this is our goal and this is where we're going and all of that. And that immediately strips out diversity. So we are forcing, one of the things that people find quite anxiety provoking about complexity is that you cannot get to consensus in complexity, because the evidence that's available to you will support multiple competing hypotheses. So if you've got a bunch of executives sitting around a table and they are truly in complexity, they will all potentially have different ideas of what's going on and what should be done, and they will all have evidence supporting it. So now if you force consensus and you need all of them to align to a particular goal, very often what you get is just pretend alignment. And also, again, you have now forced everybody into a very, very narrow option field. And again, you're losing your resilience. So this idea of coherence, it's not only from an identity perspective where it's important. It is, even just thinking about our organizations. In many companies where I've worked, there's been this idea around culture that we must have one culture. Typically it's called the whatever the company is way. So the world's view way, or the, F&B way. We don't want a single culture. We want coherence. So everybody kind of needs to be recognizable as belonging to the same organization, and we want them to be heading in the same direction and within the same, let's call them value guardrails, because if you become unrecognizable, you're no longer coherent with this organization. We do not want alignment. And then just one thing that you said, Krista, that I just quickly wanted to touch on is this notion of timing, but maybe we can stay a little bit here if you have other questions, and we just talk about this idea of time and going faster.
Yeah.
The coherent idea is very interesting, because I would imagine that leaders that are facing decisions such as such as, do I let this person die or that person die? Or do I open the country or don't I open the country? And a whole range of complex things in between that are severely strained in their own sense of coherence, because I am a good person who do good rational things. And now suddenly you are up in a space where you see that perhaps I'm not only a good rational person who do rational things, I also have access to maybe some other modes, and you know, to digress into maybe a more psychological way of saying it's there's some shadow ways that are also always there, and that contributes to the complexity of this whole state in which we find ourselves.
Something that Ingrid, sorry, Krista, to interrupt you. Something that Ingrid said early on is around complexity, not giving answers, but helping organizations ask different questions. And I think that is really key here, because notions like good and rational and responsible, what do those words even mean? And I think if we can start questioning what is good, what is responsible, because something that is responsible in a predictable ordered system may be completely irresponsible in complexity. So I think we need to cultivate curiosity and really start getting curious about what are the underlying assumptions when I say something like, I'm a good person that makes rational decisions. What does that even mean?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And I mean, coming back, and it links to the conversation that you have just had, is what questions, like I'm imagining myself standing in front of an executive team, and they want me to help them with a strategic plan. And I know that they're thinking about what they want is not complex at all. They're trying to get maximum control with milestones and accountabilities, and they're trying to maximize certainty and all the things we spoke about from a machine mindset and an internal focus. What kind of question might I ask an executive team around specifically, say, the value guardrails as a source of some measure of coherence? You're saying, let's not force consensus and do things like embed the values. You still hear a lot of that talk, like we're going to inculcate something, which assumes that we're going to mass produce a certain monoculture of thinking. How do we ask questions differently in an executive space around something like value guardrails? What the concept, how would you elaborate that concept, value guardrails, as a source of some coherence as opposed to alignment?
I'm not sure that there's one silver bullet question.
Oh, come on.
I've got one silver bullet answer for you. So in complexity, the right answer is always, it depends. that one's for free. You know, one of the things that I've learned consulting in complexity is you dance with it. And so when you're with a leadership team, like what you're talking about, it's kind of a bit of a dance, you know, that you need to find openings to start asking some of these questions. But very often just asking, because one of the things that I find is that people don't often really interrogate their decisions just by asking why. So if a company, for example, if they are saying, we want to be agile, why do you want to be agile? We want to be customer-centric. Why do you want to be customer-centric? Is it because it's what's in the latest edition of Harvard Business Review and everybody else is doing it? Or do you honestly believe that being customer-centric is what you need to do for your organization? So I think, you know, just being, because I also think executive teams in particular have fallen into the trap of surrounding themselves almost with yes men, you know, with people who are too afraid to challenge. even consultants, we're so afraid we're going to lose the work that we don't want to challenge, so I think it's almost stepping into that devil's advocate role and asking the uncomfortable questions. But, another way to, and this is why I use metaphor so much, so I'll quickly share my screen and show you one of my favorites. Just quickly, I've got two things open here. This one I've found works pretty well, especially with executives. Let me just...
I wanted to just link, while you're doing that bit of technical stuff, that question of asking why, that's what Mats Alverson offers as the solution to, are you farming stupidity and are you farming sheep, is create the space to genuinely and authentically ask why. And I think I was going to link to that and just ask you, how do you deal with the emotional frustration, fear, and resistance to shrugging off orthodoxies, to saying, you know what, Forbes magazine or Harvard Business Review is not the answer, potentially not the answer for this environment. What about here? Why? Just some process insight from you on how do you manage the fear and anxiety that goes along with asking these uncomfortable questions?
I'll answer that now, Ingrid. Just Liesel, it's not allowing me to share. It says the host has disabled participant sharing. So, Ingrid, something that I've learned, and it's hugely frustrating, because sometimes you can almost see the Kodak moment coming. You can see the black elephant, but the people that you're working with doesn't want to see. But I think what I've learned, two things. I need to be congruent with my message. So if I truly believe that the world is complex and that things are entangled and that things are uncertain, then I also can't step into that space of wanting to control and wanting to, force people to see the world the way I see it. So I've come to see my role very much almost as a sower of seeds. And sometimes the seed falls on fertile ground and sometimes it doesn't, but it's really interesting. Some of the companies that I've worked with where I felt like I've made absolutely zero difference. A couple of years down the line, I will run into some of those people, and then I find out how the seeds of ideas that I'd sown have actually spread. So I've learned to, in a way, let go of feeling that it's my responsibility to change a system or to change people's mindsets. Yeah. I can only show up in a way that is congruent with my message. I can show up in a way that is not afraid to challenge and speak truth to it, to the system. So I don't call myself a consultant or a coach. I like to call myself a thinking partner, because even just in the notion of a coach, if I coach someone, it implies that I am in some ways more evolved or better than that person because I'm able to help them improve. If I'm a thinking partner, it means I have thoughts and I have ideas, but so do you, and I'm willing to partner with you to see what can develop between us. And so I think one of the key things that when you're consulting in complexity is also understanding that sometimes you need to let go of the idea that you're going to facilitate some kind of radical change. And I think it's also understanding timing. This is circling back a bit to this timing conversation. Last year, I went to a complexity conference and there was one sentence that was like a bit of an epiphany for me. And it was, again, Alicia Guerrero, and she was talking about the different kinds of time and how and so maybe let me take a step back. So she talked about chronos time, which is chronological time, which is the time that we believe we're in, so it's kind of how the clock kind of just keeps going, moving forwards. It's linear.
Yeah.
versus the notion of kairos time, which is where time and context come together. It's almost this idea of the opportune time, so an opportune moment.
Beautiful.
And I think what we've done, or the trap that we've fallen into in this continuous search for speed and going faster, is that in speeding up in chronos in linear time, so we would just want everything to be faster and faster and faster, we are missing those kairos moments, those opportune moments when you can intervene and make a change. And we've also bought into this notion of immediacy. You know, we binge watch all our favorite series at once because we can't wait a week for the next episode. We want instant coffee and instant everything. And so waiting for a system to be ready for the message is also something that I think we need to learn.
Wow, that is so unbelievably helpful in terms of reframing our role as change agents, that the solutions are emergent and we must get over the anxiety of being a certainty merchant or a solution merchant or coming with our framework. So even the Cynefin framework, paradoxically, we could see as this is a new orthodoxy and you have to swallow this. And that's not the role. The role is to partner and see what happens and wait for these kairos moments. And I love that kairos chronos distinction, and it's very much part of mysticism and like Christian mysticism, that a chronos, that linear flow of time, event, and kairos being the moments of noetic epiphanic moments, a revelatory moment, and that is very much in the now. So it kind of brings together a lot of things for me in terms of, if we're in a kairos moment, there's more receptivity, there aren't answers, and sometimes our orthodoxies get shattered in that moment of emergence.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the thing with time, it's interesting. I spoke at a conference last year in Sweden, or actually earlier this year, and it was fascinating. I had one slide on timing, and that seemed to be the thing that everybody latched onto, because I think when we work in complexity, learning to discern time and timing is so critical. You know, if you think about a dance, if we are dancing with a system, you know, there's a time that we need to act, and there's a time that we have to wait. And this is, you know, we're in a context where, you know, we believe that, you know, leaders need to be decisive and they need to act. And, you know, you can see it with Ramaphosa, for example. Even before COVID-19, everybody was like screaming at him to take action. And I have an hypothesis that he's a leader that is kind of a natural in complexity. So I think he is, to a large extent, playing a waiting game. But sometimes we need to wait for these kairos moments and not just rush in and act. You know, and there are times when we need to go fast, and then there are times when we have to go slow. You know, Paul Sillier, he was a world-renowned complexity thinker. He used the metaphor of, you know, when you're cooking a steak, you need to cook it fast over high heat, versus when you're cooking a stew, it needs to be a slow and a long cook. Beautiful. And we tend to just want everything to be fast. And then I think a really, really challenging one is there's a time to keep going and there's a time to let go. So sometimes we actually need to, you know, I like the metaphor of pruning. So many of the executives I work with, when they are confronted with complexity and some of these double binds and detentions, they go into this space where either they become paralyzed and they won't make any decisions, or they want to just hedge all of their bets and do everything. You know, so they're struggling with prioritization. So they want to push like 10 strategic initiatives into the organization, and they don't realize what happens at the bottom, where the people need to execute, because there they're dealing with like hundreds of competing priorities. And this idea that, you know, when you think of pruning a rose bush or a fruit tree, we are all quite comfortable with cutting away branches that are diseased or dead, or, you know, there's something, or water shoots that's stealing some of the energy from the actual branches. But if we want a good fruit harvest, sometimes we need to cut away healthy branches that's already budding. And so this idea of when do we know when we actually need to stop some of our initiatives, when we, you know, we fall into the trap of we've already invested so much and now, you know, we need to keep going. In complexity, that just doesn't work. You know, you need to be willing to make the hard decisions and stop and prioritize and not just keep starting new things. So this notion of timing in complexity is actually a very key thing to get our heads around.
Amazing. And you say there, how do we know? I mean, often we have these biases and heuristics, and that's a fundamental question. I mean, it talks to everything that we have in our heads. How do we know?
Well, I think some of it is, you know, this is what I find so interesting, Ingrid. So one of the ways is we can use a sense-making framework like Cynefin that I can quickly talk you guys through if you want.
Yeah.
I think something else just to realize is that complexity is not new to human beings. You know, we kind of have this idea that, you know, complexity is, it just suddenly arose when the VUCA acronym came about. We've been working and living in complexity ever since we were little children. We all know how to manage complexity. You know, if you have ever driven a car in traffic or, you know, where there are other people, you know how to deal with complexity because traffic is a complex adaptive system. If you have any friends or social, you know, if you have any social life or an extended family, you know how to work with complexity. But in our work contexts, we've kind of just come to believe that everything is ordered and predictable. So I think some of the things that we need to challenge in ourselves is that complexity is new and novel and we don't know how to deal with it because we all do. We just need to take some of the skills we use in other kind of parts of our lives and bring it into the workplace. And the other is that complexity is bad. And, you know, I always, it's so interesting, you know, when you read, when Harvard Business Review chooses to write about complexity, very often it's something, the headline is something like taming complexity. Or, you know, it's like, I mean, just one tip, if anybody ever tells you, I will come and simplify your complexity for you, then that is the first, you need to know that then you're dealing with a snake oil salesman. You cannot simplify complexity. But complexity is not good or bad, it just is. So we just need to accept that that is what we're dealing with and adopt new ways of managing and new ways of being in the world. And I think that's where Cynefin can be really helpful.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Sonja, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, cool.
I was hoping that you were going to help me tame my family, but apparently not.
Too complex for me.
Okay, so bridging over to Cynefin, I just want to ask Christo again because he always thinks in such interesting ways. In the last bit of the conversation, what arrested your mind?
Now my mind feels somewhat arrested. I love that. I find this, how are we with complexity, a very interesting line of exploration. There's sometimes a temptation to see complexity as something out there, and I can sort of make some kind of subject-object split, and I can be the subject and the complex adaptive system is an object out there.
I'm losing you on sound, Christo.
Hey?
Sorry. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I'm losing you a bit on sound.
Oh. You're fading in and out.
Yeah.
Can you say what you just said again. Just let's see if we can hear you properly.
Okay. What I find interesting is the notion of how we are in complexity, how we show up in complexity. Because I think the thing in our world is come to terms with complexity. It is reality, and I know there may be certain domains that are maybe not complex in that description, but our world is certainly complex. And I think one of the temptations with complex worlds, or any kind of world, is that we want to see it as something which is somehow outside of us, so we can act on it, so we can act. Yeah, I'm sure, Sonja, I don't know if that's true, but it would be, it wouldn't be helpful to think that I can act on a complex adaptive system. I probably can only act inside it.
Yeah, it's a friend of mine said the other day, you know, he said, I hate traffic. And then somebody said to me, but you are the traffic. Mm-hmm. So you know, this is one of the things is there is no such thing as an independent observer or somebody, as you say, that is only acting on the system. The moment you interact with it, you are part of it. So you can influence it. You know, I think this is one of the things that's been very damaging, you know. So when complexity first entered the business world, I think it was introduced by scaremongers in a way, because the message that many people got was complexity is unmanageable. You know, it's like you can't manage, and that is simply not true, but you have to manage differently.
So that's, I mean, like this idea of managing differently. I mean, I think that's in my understanding what Cynefin offers, like ideas like probe, sense, respond. Maybe you can take us into some of that, like the how. What does probe, sense, respond even mean?
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So that is Dave Snowden, and I think it's really, so Cynefin is a framework that is, you know, it's an action-oriented sense-making framework. So it's you know, when he talks about it and in all of his writing, it's around how do we make sense of the world so that we can act in it. So it's not only about understanding the world, it's about knowing how to act. Sorry, I just need to advance the slide. So Cynefin is a Welsh word, and it basically means place of our multiple belongings. There's no English translation for it. The nearest is habitat or place, but that just simply does not capture it. But it really is very deeply rooted in this idea of us always being embedded in multiple contexts that we are only ever partially aware of. So one of the key things when you use Cynefin is this idea of bounded applicability. So I was quite extreme when I spoke about, you know, we need to ban ideas like alignment. It's not entirely true. You know, things like alignment are useful when you're dealing with an ordered system. But when you're in complexity, it's not. So one of the key things that complexity of that Cynefin helps us understand is what kind of a system are we in? What kind of a problem are we dealing with? And therefore, which of our methods and tools are applicable, and how do we manage, how must we be in the system? So I don't have a huge amount of time left, so I'm going to go quite fast. But what you'll see on the screen, so, and you know, firstly, Cynefin is drawn like this for a reason. It is not a 2x2 matrix with you know, rigid, solid lines, and it doesn't have quadrants. So many, you know, people would say you know, which quadrant does it belong to? Cynefin has 7 domains. I'll only talk through the five main ones today. But at its heart, what Cynefin helps us do is to differentiate between 3 different kinds of systems. So we've already spoken about 2. So we spoke about complicated systems, and those are examples of ordered systems, and they sit on the right-hand side of Cynefin. So Cynefin helps us distinguish between 2 kinds of ordered systems. So in the bottom domain, we've got what used to be called obvious, it's now called clear. And this is where there is a completely clear and predictable link between cause and effect. So the system is completely predictable. I've seen it before. Everything has basically become known. I'm dealing with known knowns. And this is where I can apply best practice. So if everything is known, you know, so if you think, for example, about accounting, we are not learning and inventing new accounting rules. Everything is known. That is why we can automate accounting systems, because we can program algorithms to do that. So when we are in the clear domain of Cynefin, and the example that I've got there is, we all know what side of the road we drive on in different countries, and we understand the implications if we don't. An example of a clear problem would be, I have a flat tire. It's self-evident to anybody what the problem is, and there's essentially a best practice way to solve it. When I move into the complicated domain, and the thing that's similar between complicated and clear is that we're dealing with closed, predictable systems, and so outcomes are clear and known. In complicated, it's not self-evident. So there is still a direct link between cause and effect. So I'm dealing with known unknowns, but I need to do some analysis, or I need to call an expert. It's like designing a traffic management system, or, you know, something like in our world, it could be, you know, like an employee benefit system. Creating the system requires some expertise, and it might require some analysis, but the outcome is still stable and fully known. So I know what I don't know. So here I apply good practice, because, you know, there are many different ways that I can design a system like that. And they might all be right, but the outcome will be similar. So I can focus on fail-safe design, and this is the legitimate domain of the expert. So I don't know, Ingrid, if I should pause here, if you've got any questions so far, or if I must just cover the other two domains as well.
I want to ask you if you can cover the other domains, because we've only got 9 minutes, and I know you've got a very hard stop, and I want to thank you effusively, at least for 1 minute at the end.
It's fine. I can probably, I can be about 5 or 10 minutes late for the next meeting. I just need to show up. It's an internal meeting. It would be bad if the CEO doesn't show.
Yeah.
So then if we go onto the other side of Cynefin, this is where we're going into systems that are no longer ordered and predictable in the same, so then these are open systems. So here we have complex that we've spoken a lot about this morning, and here we're dealing with unknown unknowns. These systems are not equal to the sum of their parts. So you'll see the example that I've got there is driving on South Africa, or any road for that matter. You know, you immediately need to become more aware of your surroundings. It's not only about you. There are multiple other drivers around you that are unpredictable. So you immediately need to be much more situationally aware. And my interaction with the system actually changes the system. So the more of us that treat our traffic laws as if they're suggestions, the more we are creating a culture of rule breaking on our roads. So other people influence me, I influence them, and together we're creating this emergent pattern. So the way that we interact with complex systems is we need to interact with them to understand them. So as I said, we dance with the system. So what we do is we run safe to fail experiments, or, you know, the probing essentially is disturbing the system, interacting with it, seeing what happens when I do small things. And the key here is that in a complex system, you want to try and avoid big, one-size-fits-all solutions, because the one thing that is certain in complex systems is that if you intervene, if you do something, there will be unintended consequences. So you want to act small, act local, see if things can spread naturally instead of going with these, you know, one of the things that is the end of many agile implementations, for example, is the moment you implement something like SAFE. A one-size-fits-all, very unagile, very ordered solution to create a mindset or a way of being in a way. So how can we, by tweaking, for example, some of the rules, some of the constraints, some of the processes, if we introduce different agile methods in different areas, can we stimulate emergent agility that is fit for context? So we don't think about fail-safe design and one size fits all when we're dealing with complexity. We think about safe to fail experiments and how can we stimulate emergence, basically. And then the fourth domain is the domain of chaos. And this is where we're dealing with unknowable unknowns. We're typically this is the domain of crisis. So car is on fire, all we can do is act. And you can see now with COVID-19, we are cycling through the central domain of Cynefin, which is what we're calling the confused domain. It's where I actually don't have enough information. I don't know what is going on. I need to do sense making to find out where I am. I think COVID-19 and this pandemic is having us cycling through complex confusion and chaos. And we know we're kind of bouncing around these three domains. And the problem is that almost all of our management modalities, all of our tools for managing change and all of these things come from the world of order. And those linear approaches, the ways of thinking that we explored earlier, they simply don't help us when we are in these complex and even chaotic domains. So I think one of the key uses right now, especially for decision makers, is to be able to identify, even in this crisis, which aspects are still clear and complicated, because those we can kind of get off the table, get them out the way, and free up our headspace and our decision-making capability to deal with the things sitting in complex and in chaotic. And this is also where we cannot afford to be paralyzed, because in chaos, for example, the worst thing you can do is to not act, even if what you do is the wrong thing. You need to act, try and create some stability, but then have very fast feedback loops so that you're able to adapt quite quickly. And then maybe just quickly, Ingrid, another key thing that we tend to forget, you'll see right at the bottom of the framework, there's this little hook. We call that it's got several names. It's the Catastrophic Fold, or I like to call it the Complacency Boundary or the Complacency Cliff. And this is where we think we know everything. We think that everything is known and the system is still stable and all of our processes are still reliable, even in the changed context. And that essentially, it collapses our system into chaos. We fall over the cliff. It's like having a Kodak moment. And so right now where we are, I think one of the key things that we absolutely have to do is to get better feedback mechanisms in place so that we can truly understand where we are in the evolving context. And we need to question our assumptions, and we need to question these holy cow processes that's been in our organizations for however long, policies and processes that right now have actually become dangerous in the new context.
Can you give us an example of something like that, a policy or process that's become dangerous?
So something, for example, if you think of health and safety, many companies have health and safety rule books this thick. And what they've done is they've created a compliance-driven approach to safety. You know, we've done exactly the same thing with diversity as well. But so now we have all these checklists in place, checklists for safety, checklists for, you know, even from a health perspective that come from a completely different context. And what we've done is we've taught people not to think. So the moment we have made it solely about compliance, so now with COVID-19, all of a sudden it's become dangerous to touch the button on an elevator, or to even touch a doorknob, or and we don't have policies and procedures for those. And if we have a checklist mentality and the checklist does not say, don't touch the doorknob, then people are going to just keep following the policy and the process, and they're not going to think for themselves that the context has shifted. And I think that is the danger, is that we're creating mindless organizations who are, and I like to call them holy cow processes, because, you know, this is why I think people who think differently and people who enter organizations, you know, I think millennials in particular really struggle with this, because they like to understand why things work the way it works. And we've got these processes and policies in our organizations that have become so holy in a way that nobody's allowed to question them, because it's just how we've always done things. And now we cannot afford that. We need to be questioning these processes.
That's really interesting. And I've got a huge cultural element to that, of if you're dealing with organizations, for those who know the Enneagram, that have a very Enneagram one-ish leadership style or leadership culture, is a rigidity where the hammer for every nail or for every problem is a policy or a rule or some kind of solution. And it does create a mindlessness where there isn't actually space to ask why. You know, it's just the way things are done around here. And so, yeah, I'm hearing a lot of implications for culture thinking.
And I think the other thing, Ingrid, is that in complexity, you can't avoid failure. Because we're dealing with unknown unknowns. We're exploring. And I think we've paid lip service to failure. You know, we kind of, you know, we need to, in Agile, for example, we've got fail early and fail fast, you know, and we've got, but then we all know what will happen if you actually fail, you know, and I think, and it goes back to this thing of what does it really mean to be a learning and an adaptive organization? What do we do with mistakes? Do we allow people to make mistakes and learn and fail? How do we create safe to fail environments? Yeah. All of these, I think, are questions for the OD community to grapple with, because if we don't create safe spaces where people can learn and explore, and where we keep our options open, then we are all heading for, not extinction necessarily, but we're heading for trouble with the volatility currently in the external environment.
Sure, that is absolutely wonderful. We've come to, I see we're on 10:31. So do you have a couple of minutes for a bit of a wrap up? I want to ask Christo again for any epiphanic, noetic, kairos moments, and then just close out.
For me, the thing that stands out here is just what's our work as early practitioners. So Sonja, I appreciate what you've been saying there. Because we have created organizational worlds that have become so rigid, and in which leaders and other actors in the organization are so constrained that they don't have agency, or they have very limited agency. And I know one of the key concepts in your complexity work is the notion of constraints, governing constraints, enabling constraints, and I presume some of that is that creation of an environment in which people can take chances, they can challenge notions, they can step up, they can make mistakes. And all of those things, I think I would probably guess that in itself is a piece of complex work that faces us. But just a question, there's a space there in the middle, the space of disorder. Can you maybe just say something about disorder or unorder? What
disorder also has a new name. So you'll see, so what you'll have to invite me back for another episode, I think.
Yes. Definitely.
So the green line there is what we're calling the liminal spaces. So it's almost the spaces of transition between the different domains. And you'll see that the green line intersects that central domain. So it used to be called disorder. We now are calling it the A/C domain, or the generic term would be the domain of confusion. So it's called confused. But that is overlaid with green. The technical term that Dave has adopted that very few people understand is aporetic. But to put it in normal people speak, the gray that's not overlain, so this part here, the gray there, is almost the domain of illegitimate confusion. So you're confused, you don't realize that you're confused. So you think you know, but you actually don't. And so you are, for example, using complicated approaches in complexity. You are confused and unaware. The green space there, the aporetic space, is where you are confused and you are aware that you are confused. And if you are in that space, then there are multiple, Dave has just come up with 6 pathways out of confusion, things that you can do to transition into the other domains, but it requires being mindful or aware that you are confused. And I think that is one of the big problems that we face, is that we have too many people who still think that they know and that the old answers are applicable. And it's a very uncomfortable space to be, Christo, because we need to make peace with the fact that our old competencies, you know, the things that brought us to where we are, the things that we felt we might even be an expert in, you know, that feeling of being competent, that is being challenged, because we're all in uncharted territory. And it's why I don't like calling myself an expert, because I don't really know how many experts there are around anymore. You know, we're all kind of, you know, learning together. And so that central domain is confusion, and you're either confused and you know it, or you're confused and you don't know it, and then you're in trouble.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I think that's almost it's one of the trends that we see in managerial responses to COVID is a kind of a confused response. Of either we're going to return this thing to normal, it's actually just a complicated system and we need to find some steps and a path through it.
It's just a flu.
Yeah, it's just a flu. And then the difficult place, I think, for leaders is I mean, that's for me, my sense of that is it's almost like an animal confusion. You have no way to find some coherence for yourself. But if you are in confusion and you're aware of confusion, then there is a seed of coherence. But that's a difficult and a painful place for leaders and managers to be, because it is the place of actually actively stripping away certainties, reconsidering the nature of the worlds with which we are confronted, and so on.
Brilliant.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. So, yeah, giving you a minute to go, Sonja, I just want to thank you so much. And you mentioned the 6 pathways out of confusion, and I'm definitely going to take you up on your offer to have another conversation. I think it would be totally amazing if you could come back at some point and talk about the green and the gray and how this model has been evolving. It just sounds like there's such interesting, fresh thinking going on. So yeah, on behalf of all of us, I just want to say thank you so much. It's been unbelievably rich and fantastic. And if you're confused and you know it, clap your hands. And I just want to hand over to Liesel on behalf of World's View Academy to say thank you.
Oh. Yeah, thanks, Sonja. I'm with Ingrid. We're definitely going to take you up on episode 2. We'll give it a week or 3. I'm not going to say for things to calm down, because No, it won't. We'll be in touch, and thank you. And thank you for having been such a great thinking partner to World's View and to me and Chris too in many instances. Tell us about it.
Thank you, Liesl, and it was a big pleasure. You know, if anybody, I blog, you can go and have a look on morebeyond.co.za. There are a couple of things there, like the difference between complicated and complex. So, you know, I can only say so much. So there is some stuff there if you want to do some further reading. So,
Brilliant.
thanks for the invitation, and enjoy the rest of your conversation.